So, hello everybody. My name is Claire Bian. I'm the president of ISPS-US, and I'm so pleased to be able to facilitate this webinar on family dynamics and voice hearing, which Pat Wright, Dmitry Gutkovich, and Ed Herzog will speak about effective and supportive communications. I've had the pleasure of working with all three of our presenters, Pat as a member and family chair of ISPS-US, and Dmitry and Ed as fellow board members of the Hearing Voices Network USA. And Dmitry also recently, a couple of years ago, became chair of the Experts by Experience Committee. We'd like to hold questions to the end. Pat, Ed, and Dmitry will each give their presentations, and then we'll open the session up to the Q&A. Please write your questions in the chat as they arise. After the presentations, I'll read the questions largely in order, and our panelists will respond. And we'll try to get through all of the questions, but if we don't, please feel free to get in touch with each of our panelists. And it would be great, Pat, Ed, and Dmitry, if you all would type your email addresses into the chat so folks can get in touch with you directly. And you all are muted. I will mute myself as well as stop my video, and the panelists who are not speaking will do the same, and then we'll all be visible again at the end of the webinar. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Claire. And welcome everybody, and so glad that you're here this morning. I was just mentioning with Dmitry how this is really a milestone in the community of people that hear voices and family members that we're sharing space, talking about what happens in families and different roles that people play. And Ed will also be sharing with us about setting up a family and friends group, which I found very helpful over the years. I want to open with a Native American blessing, since I am on Dakota territory here in Minneapolis, Minnesota. I release my partner from the obligation to complete me. I release my parents from the feeling they failed with me. I release my children from the need to bring me pride, so they can write their own paths to the rhythm of their hearts. I don't lack anything. I cherish my essence, my way of expressing it, even if not everyone can understand me. I learn from all beings all the time. I honor the divinity in me and you. I wanted to do this panel for three reasons. The first, I've worked with families over 3 decades, so advocating for them is in my blood. I learned skills in the disability policy world after having life-threatening health issues in the early 90s. The second is I've had a front row seat in watching the evolution of the mental health field through the experience of ancestors, siblings, my kids, as well as my own. And the third is I feel that since there's been so much isolation, alienation, and divisiveness caused by systems, interventions in families, that sharing space such as this webinar with both parents and people with lived experience can be healing. I'm honored to be here with Dmitry and Ed, who have both been committed to the movement, as you will hear soon if you are not familiar with their work already. We appreciate Claire, as she mentioned, our ISPS chair, in assisting us with the technology. Could you share my family photo, please, Claire? This is my, as Claire's getting it ready, this is my large, diverse family photo. It's about 5 years old. It's my mother's 90th birthday. And as you can see, there's people of various ages. There were 9 kids in my immediate family. And of course, then we've gotten married and had kids and multiplied. Now there we all are outside in September. And I love this photo because it reflects the diversity that we have from different countries. And when we get together, it's really fun that we have food from all over in all these delicious meals. So the outline of my talk is a little family background, my perspective as a parent, and what was helpful and not so helpful, because there were certainly things that weren't helpful. And then finally, in wrapping up, a vision for the future. Okay, we'll be keeping the chat, so I want to invite you to post comments and things you found helpful in your families as well. We won't be looking at them, as Claire mentioned, until the end when we do questions. But if you're inspired, please post a comment. Okay, a little background. I was second oldest in this family. I don't know if you can see me down by holding the hand of the woman in the wheelchair. Shall we go on, Claire? And I think people had an opportunity to see my family there. I grew up with a younger sister who spent most of her life in the hospital. I felt compassion for her, especially since I would hear stories from her of horrific treatment by many people she encountered, both professional and non-professional. Both my dad and his mom had shock treatments over the years, so I had lots of fear and distrust towards the mental health system. It sounded really brutal to me. I also experienced shame within my family about being different. Also, I experienced some of my own extreme states along the way, including a locked unit in the hospital for a while. After getting married and having small kids, I started having unexplainable health symptoms. I talked my mom into seeking out her biological family, since I thought there might be clues there. More evidence of relatives dying in sanitariums and having the term mental deficiency written on their death certificates. I got better by the benefits of holistic ways of healing, for example, acupuncture, energy work, etc. I was listened to, respected, and told I had a healer inside. Imagine what it was like then when I went to the doctor and they said, "Mrs. Wright, here are your pills," without any explanation. And when I asked, they were not willing to go into detail. Let's just leave it like that. Given what I knew about my family's experiences and the difference in how I had been treated by the medical system versus the alternative providers I saw, I limited my visits with the medical system as much as possible. Although I was able to find some great doctors that were very helpful over the years. As I was getting stronger and more active in the disability policy field, my son's challenges were disrupting his life more and more. It got really scary when he was starting to tell me that he did not want to live. And I did the only thing I knew what to do at the time. We went for an evaluation. And we were told that he was in a psychotic state and needed to be hospitalized ASAP. Needless to say, I was determined to find alternative resources. So I got online and began exploring options. I found ISPS and attended a conference near me in Chicago. I asked the director about any family events. She suggested I gather parents during lunch, which we did. At that conference, I also met Ron Coleman, who talked about his voices openly. I started feeling hopeful. There were people willing to share their experiences. I wasn't alone. I was hungry to learn a new way of supporting my son. There were lots of obstacles, but here's what happened. A parent's perspective. Gabe and I had always been close. He was well liked at school, played sports, and could be found skate or snowboarding in his free time. Although, unfortunately, my son has had several hospitalizations over the past dozen years, we've managed to stay close, which I feel very grateful for. He is definitely one of my greatest teachers. At times he was court ordered to be hospitalized. Other times he went voluntarily, usually after discussing the decision with his counselor and myself. I so longed for other places he could go to, for instance, like Soteria House. I feel regretful about calling the police, especially early on, before I had more choices, and have apologized to my son, knowing the trauma this caused on top of what was already going on with him. We've had many discussions about these hospitalizations, which have been very healing for both of us. There were times also in the early years of being hospitalized when he refused to talk to me. Eventually, I learned the delicate balance of being there for him without being there in person physically until he was ready. Fortunately, Gabe had a wonderful counselor the second year into this adventure that we both trusted, and she was our link to the systems and court, including court, hospital, and benefits. Even though my son's dad was a counselor, he believed meds and the hospital were the best idea, so I didn't look to him for support. I learned over time the benefits of reaching out and finding like-minded people to get and give support. This has been crucial for me, especially talking to people with lived experience and understanding that point of view. They have been some of my best teachers, in particular giving me hope when I had lost mine, which would happen over the years. There are many situations I could share regarding examples of communication that helped, but I'll focus on two in particular. The first one was a time my son was staying on my couch. Oh, this is maybe, I don't know, 6, 7, maybe 8 years ago now. He wasn't doing well. So when life gets hard for him, he likes to be close. My daughter was in her room sleeping. It was 4 a.m. I woke up to banging and screaming. I got out of bed, went into the hall where my daughter was yelling at her brother to get out of her room. It was hard to know what was going on since my son wasn't sharing much at the time. But a few months later, while we were out staining the balcony, he shared with me how he'd gone up to his sister's room because he knew some guys had broken into the house and gone up there. He was going up to protect her. There's a very heroic act and explained the stunned look I remembered him having that night. It all made sense in the context. Could you put up the Stephen Porges slide, please, Claire? This is a neuroscientist that wrote a book on the polyvagal theory. And what he has discovered is that there's a third nervous system that determines people's social engagement. And this is a quote from him. Trauma compromises our ability to engage with others by replacing patterns of connection with patterns of protection. And this is exactly what happens. Both my son and my daughter were into patterns of protection rather than talking about at the time what was going on. The second situation was at the hospital. This was a few years ago. He'd been there for several weeks, having gone there voluntarily. We can put the slide down, Claire, whenever you're ready. Thank you. And it was confusing to figure out why he was still in the hospital. And both of us were getting very frustrated and angry, to say the least. One day after he refused an EKG, I happened to be in the neighborhood and stopped by. He was very angry. I asked if he wanted to have a meeting with people on the unit to find out what was happening. He agreed. So we went to a conference room with a social worker and a couple of the doctors. Immediately, the doctor looked at me and started explaining why they wanted to change his meds to Clara. I interrupted and told them that it was Gabe who wanted to speak with them. So let's first hear what he had to say. I was amazed at how difficult it was to have them focus on Gabe, being that, you know, he was the one that was staying there and he was the one that was really upset. Gabe proceeded to tell them how angry he was about being there and how he wasn't responding to their questions every morning because they weren't listening to what he was saying, only wanting answers to their particular questions about medications. As painful as it was to hear, I told my son how proud I was of him speaking his truth. I appreciated the courage it took for him to stand up for himself. Somehow, not long after that, he was released. And I wondered how many other people in the unit would have agreed to not being heard by the doctors. In closing, I want to end on a hopeful note. I'm a different person having gone through these experiences with my son. I've been able, with my son's permission, share what I'm learning along the way. I've received much wisdom from others, and I like to be able to share when I can. Fortunately, my son has found a new place to live that is working well for him for over a year now. He's been out of the hospital for 18 months, which is a record, and he found a job he likes last fall. We're going on vacation next week, which is very exciting. And doing those types of shared activities, we also make bread together, we watch movies, we do yard work, and it's all very healing for our relationship. By the way, I asked him if he found anything I did helpful over the years in preparation for this webinar. He told me that listening to him and telling him that he would get better were important ways I'd made a difference. And I needed to tell him that because I needed to see him getting better. And that's what people had told me. So I felt like that was important, and it sounds like it was helpful. We are in a time of great social upheaval. I'm in Minneapolis. I've been witnessing it firsthand here the last year and a half or so. We are finding new compassionate, respectful, and innovative frameworks for working with extreme states, voices, and unusual beliefs. I see this as a bridge building time. There used to be only NAMI for families, who at the time thought they were doing the best thing to care for their family members. There used to be, but now, we have multiple frameworks: family and friends for HVN that Ed's going to tell us about, open dialogue, and places like Soteria House and Windhorse. As we're learning from the WHO report that came out this year, the benefits of dialogic practices and seeing treatment as a human rights issue is becoming the dominant world model. And hopefully the US will be jumping on board. How different my family legacy could have been instead of isolation and separation. Hopefully in my new granddaughter's time, there will be more compassionate communication so families can heal and change the legacy. And I just want to close with another quote. And this one, if you could put it up, please, Claire. This is from Resma Meneken, who is from Minnesota. And it's about trauma. Trauma in a person decontextualized over time looks like personality. Trauma in a family decontextualized over time looks like family traits. Trauma in a people decontextualized over time looks like culture. Hopefully we are changing the culture. Thank you, everybody. Now, Dimitri will be telling us all about life from the perspective of person with lived experience and what he's learned about family. Thank you so much. Go ahead, Dimitri. Oh, it looks like Claire needs to unmute Dimitri.
Sorry, I am on
Okay.
it.
Thanks.
Can you unmute yourself now?
Yes, excellent. Thank you so much, Claire. And thank you so much, Pat, for that wonderful perspective and for all the work you do. I think that having family members who advocate for those with lived experience and multiple frameworks, multiple approaches, giving the community options is so invaluable. And to your point, at its core, perhaps what we're changing is a culture. And it's very important that we do so because the current culture creates a lot of unnecessary pain. So talking a little bit more about my experience, for those of you who don't know me, I've been hearing voices for 12 years now, still hear them every day, but I have a great, at this point, even career in digital marketing, have a family with a wife and a daughter. You know, I was able to fight for the quality of life that seemed to be promised to a lot of others. With that, of course, there's a lot of background in ways that I was lucky. A family that was very supportive, certain resources. So I don't want to take credit for what I've been able to achieve, but at least show that it is possible. And I'll walk you through my story with a specific focus on family dynamics, what was helpful, and what definitely needs to change in our culture. So I started hearing voices in 2009. I was in college at the time, and the dean called my family. I wasn't attending classes. People said that they were concerned about me, and they were right. I was going through a difficult time, and it was probably good that my family got involved, was able to help me and navigate me in that moment. With that said, we went to see the medical authority, so to speak, the authority, of course, from certain perspective, because very little is known about hearing voices, very little is known about moments of crisis. It's a largely unknown phenomena. So medical authority is a term perhaps more loosely used than in other fields where a surgeon will tell you precisely what needs to be operated on, or a spiritual advisor can tell you that there's nothing pathological at all in this particular situation. But regardless of the framework, at the time, I did need help. What I remember, however, is a certain prescribed hopelessness, which is a term in our community that rallies a lot of people to advocacy. I told you I have my own daughter now, and one of my first catchphrases with her, whenever she tries to stand or to talk or anything, any major milestone is, "You can do it. I believe in you." Something that simple. And as I was reflecting on this webinar, I realized how much that was taken away from me, how much it was told to myself, to my family, that likely I wouldn't make it, that likely I should give up on ambition, give up on trying to have my own family, living independently, that likely I would be chained down to medication and surviving for decades, if not for the rest of my life. I understand that often medical providers see people in crisis. They see the part of our community that is going through the most difficult times at their most difficult times. So they have a skewed perspective on the phenomena and how many people do in fact make it, do in fact reclaim their life. But with that said, like any dream, it's easier to achieve with the support and hope and faith of those around you. So I did not lose the love of my family, but to a large extent, I did lose their faith in my potential, which was very difficult. And so as I found my path to recovery, I was carried in part by love of my community and my support structure, but a lot of it was pride. The idea that I refuse to give up, even though the common narrative is that I won't make it. I think that pride is an excellent supporter in these kinds of cases, but it's really sad that it had to come down to it. That for something that was solvable, I didn't have a team of loved ones rallying me on, but rather doubting me, in part because that was what the authority on a completely not understood phenomena had decreed. There was also secondary consequences to this reality. As I was reclaiming my life, I was very mindful to not trigger my family in their caretaker role, to not show symptoms, to not have them worry about my belief structure and possible delusion. So for example, if I thought people from the government were following me, which there was probably a few weeks back in 2010 when I considered it, I'm sure if I said it out loud, I would hear how it sounds. Maybe somebody would say, oh, where would they get the resources for all those people for the many voice hearers? How did nobody post it? And if I was able to talk about it in my own framework, within my own logic, which did exist, which always exists for all of us. Like Pat said with Gabe, there's always an internal story, an internal logic. If I was able to say it out loud and have a back and forth on it, I think I would have a lot easier of a time sorting and managing my overall belief structure. In addition, in part to not cause worry to my family, in part to protect myself, patterns of protection, I almost splintered myself into two worlds. Part of this is still true to this day. The conversations I have with my voices, the storylines, they don't get said out loud. I don't tell people my inner reality. I communicate my feelings and hopes with my wife, with my friends, but it's always about my physical world, accomplishments and dreams and events. There's a large part of me that never gets spoken. That isolation, that living in two separate worlds, it does two things. One is it causes enormous amounts of pain. And the second is that it almost splinters that second world, the voices, to not becoming part of the reality, to not becoming part of a shared physical space. And in that silence, there's both pain and challenges to reclaiming one's life. Now, I told you I have a wonderful family. I'm very blessed in that way. But even so, 12 years later, I find my mother watching for symptoms. If I get distracted, I see the look of concern on her face. She still checks in once in a while, how I am, what's going on with me, little tests for her own self-assurance. I've grown to find inner peace with that, with understanding her perspective, that there's pain all around, that she also went through trauma with my experience. But I wonder how many families don't understand that dynamic, that both people have gone through trauma, and that with the caretaker role assigned and the loss of faith, this really painful dynamic of losing a friend and gaining a caretaker is a wound straight through the heart, for an accurate metaphor. It's almost the deepest cuts in the long run to not be believed in by those around us that we love. I told you I was able to reclaim my life, family, career, independence, all of it. Even so, though, I think I got better probably within a year and a half. This dynamic with my loved ones persisted probably closer for 5 or 6 years. And it's always on a spectrum, right? So it's not like they were completely not engaging me as a peer or as a friend, but it was always there, this dynamic of doubt in my stability, in my perspectives. For the record, by the way, in terms of what I'm about to say, I completely believe the earth is round. I don't want anybody confused on that. But I've been thinking about flat earthers, not their perspective, but their fortune, their privilege, that even believing something as absurd as that the earth is flat, they still seem to maintain, for at least from what I've read, the respect of their peers. People won't engage with them on that topic. Maybe they won't take them seriously on science, but they keep a community where they engage in political conversation. They could relay events from their life and be believed. So even a belief structure like that seems to not completely cut at the faith of one's community. Whereas saying a simple truth that, oh, I hear voices, immediately does in a deep and lasting way. So a few years ago, I heard a squirrel talking or making a sound, you know, cows say moo, horses say neigh, I guess. I heard the sound a squirrel makes. And if you think about it, that's pretty rare. And I tried to tell my parents, and of course, they were very concerned. And so I wonder, even as I'm saying this, since most of you probably have never heard what a squirrel sounds like, if you also are wondering whether I imagined it. Even hearing how I speak, it's one of the questions, right? A voice here says he's experiencing something that I have no experience in. Is it real? Fortunately, Claire, if you can either play the video or allow me to share screen. Fortunately, in this particular case, I recorded it. So I was able to prove it. Looks like it's a photo there. So we'll give Claire a moment.
Sorry, I'm getting
Yeah, no problem.
windows open on my desktop.
Yeah, so it just, there we go. This is just interesting in general, by the way. I've never heard a squirrel make sounds, and I was very surprised that
Your computer
this is what
sound. Getting there. I'm sorry.
It's completely okay. Renee also has. It's very strange, right? We see them all the time. We never hear them make a sound. Claire, I could also share screen and do it on mine if you would enable it.
The ability to share screen.
Yeah. Okay. Regardless, I'll keep going for now, and I'll play it in the end. I wanted to make clear that this is an issue that isn't just about lived experience. Of course, our families go through trauma when they see us in a state of crisis. Even so, the main culture that we go to right now promotes hopelessness for everyone involved. And I've said this on other webinars, but if you think about it, even from a medical model, if somebody tells you, oh, are your voices going to hurt yourself, tell you to hurt yourself or others, in the medical model especially, we build that profile for the voice and that becomes our experience. If you say, oh, you won't be able to, you won't be able to gain control of your voices, that becomes our experience. And so in Hearing Voices Network, we've repeatedly shown and believed that being empowered over those voices, being able to negotiate with them, being able to set boundaries and change the dynamic is the key to navigating the experience. And being told that, no, that's not a thing, you can't do it, when so many people can, is a very real problem. Let's see if we have a talking squirrel for 12 seconds.
Okay, and tell me if you can, I think the share computer sound is still on.
Yeah, it takes a while to even believe it's a squirrel and not a bird, right? But you can clearly see its throat moving. Yeah, so the broader point is I had to prove it, and I was lucky that I could, because everyone was immediately concerned for my telling the truth, something that I clearly have evidence of. But how many things do I say that sound strange that I can't prove? How many opinions on philosophy or politics or society always come with that bit of doubt from anyone that knows my history? I told you that I work at Hearing Voices Network. I've facilitated groups, I've talked to other group facilitators, and this is not a rare experience. People losing their close family and friends to the caretaker dynamic is a very widespread source of pain, as is the result, which is that instead of having a caretaker who we can share with and can guide our belief structures or our attention, or give us core skills for reclaiming our lives, those of us who enter crisis, we simply adapt to not showing those parts of ourselves for the most part. And so we, as a community, often live in two worlds, the one that gets spoken and then the one that happens inside of us, the stories, the conversations with voices, which are often fascinating, by the way. From facilitating groups, people have the most amazing stories, and they never share it, or they rarely share it, because the first thing that happens is judgment and concern. And so with that, I want to be mindful of the time and make sure we have enough for Q&A, but I want to end not with any answer, not with any conclusion, but a core question for everyone here. I was in crisis. Obviously, the team that was helping me through it couldn't be there with me at all times, so they recruited my family. Was there real value in this approach? Yes, it makes sense. Make sure that I didn't go out and do something really stupid, something I couldn't take back. I get it. I do. Was there real damage from what was done? Also, yes. It took me more than half a decade to recover a dynamic with my brother, who's my closest friend, where we talk casually, and I could tell that he's not concerned about me, that he has full faith in every idea I say. It took years. So yeah, there was some value, probably for a month or two. There was real damage for 5 years or so. The question is, why is the message hopelessness? Why are we defeated before we even try to stand from our challenges? And why, of all the painful things, do the people closest to us, our families, become the carriers of that message, that we need to be watched over, that we need to be shielded, that we won't stand, that no, they don't have faith in us because no, we can't do it. I don't have the answer of what's ideal here. I'm here to say there's something very wrong in our culture and how this issue is handled from a perspective of family dynamics. I hope that all these conversations will continue to ripple, and that as a society, we will demand to move to something better. Okay, next up we have Ed, who does a lot in terms of the work that I'm describing, creating groups specifically for families and close friends to share their part of the experience, and really has been a huge figure in organizing those kinds of communities and creating change there. So that's my story. I'm sticking to it. And next up, Ed, who also has a very valuable message to share.
Thank you, Dimitri. If you haven't read Dimitri's book, I'd highly recommend it. It's incredibly inspiring. And I'm here in Berkeley, California, Bay Area, talking to you. And I think I call my talk a family story of recovery. And so maybe Claire, if you could put up the PowerPoint, starting with slide 2, that'd be great. And about 10 years ago, my son told me he was hearing voices. And like many family members, I was mystified and startled to hear this announcement. I didn't know anything about this experience, so I turned to the mental health professionals for answers, and they told me his voices were dangerous and that I had to babysit him 24/7 to stop him from acting on his voices. But the voices got stronger, stranger, and more alarming to me. And so we decided to visit a community mental health clinic. While there, I think out of fear, he began to act out and make aggressive statements to the mental health care workers. Alarmed, they decided he was a danger to himself and to others and decided to 5150 him. In California, that means putting someone in a hospital against their will. He was handcuffed to a gurney by police and taken away in an ambulance to our public mental health hospital. I was not permitted to see him or talk to him and was told by them to go home and relax. It was probably the worst day of my life. When I was permitted to see him finally after 3 days later, he was lying on the ground in the hospital's rec room alone, shaking and drooling from the side effects of the Haldol they had given him. I bent down to comfort him and yelled for someone to help him. A nurse finally showed up and gave him a shot to soothe him. So began our journey through our county's public mental health care system. 3 years later, more hospitalizations and boatloads of drugs, nothing had improved. He was still hearing voices and was miserable. Now living with us, we were miserable with him, though he continued to take medications as ordered by his doctor. They did nothing to soothe his voices or his anxieties. I remember telling my son, just take the medication, that he had a mental illness like diabetes. We were desperate and felt we had nowhere to turn. Thankfully, going online, my wife discovered the Hearing Voices movement, and I attended a workshop with Ron Coleman, which you heard about. He's a mental hospital survivor and a long-term founder of the Hearing Voices movement. Clara, if you could put on slide 3, that'd be great. Most importantly to me, Ron Coleman offered a different perspective on voice hearing. And what stood out? That to him, voices were real. That was a profoundly different way of looking at my son's voices. Up until that time, I had been assuming my son's voices were symptoms of an illness or figments of his imagination, and that my job was to reassure him, to fix him, and prove to him that they were not real. I remember one night, he was sure there were people outside our house out to get him. I took him out into the middle of our street in the middle of the night and tried to point out that there was nobody there. But it didn't help. He was still terrified and sure his voices were real and he was in danger. Ron taught me to step back from my own assumptions and look at my responses to his voices. I realized the decisions I had made in the past were primarily based on my own fears of a reality profoundly different from my own. Clara, slide 4, please. Instead of fear, I started to listen to him. Instead of judgments about what he was saying, I approached him with a sense of curiosity about his experience. I discarded my assumptions that his voices were a symptom of his mental illness, and instead began to try and understand the content of his voices. I discovered the maastricht interview process that offers a set of questions that helps guide us to the story behind his voices and look at their content. This shift also lowered the emotional temperature in our house. It decreased my stress and also allowed me to change the way I see him. Instead of my preconceptions that pigeonholed him into a frame of reference that did not work for either of us, I started seeing him with an open mind, a practice of not knowing, a calm place in the middle of periods of chaos where I am not limited by what I think I know about his experiences and his voices. But as a family member, you know this is not easy. As parents, when faced with a loved one who is struggling with their voices, we have waves of feelings that sometimes overwhelm us, like grief, helplessness, and dashed expectations and hopes for our loved one. I learned that I needed to own these feelings as separate from our child, or we see him as the identified patient and the cause of our suffering. Unfortunately, many of us make decisions based on our feelings of fear and anxiety, with little idea about what is actually happening with our loved ones. We adopt one model or framework of understanding voices, frequently the medical model, at the exclusion of others. As a result, the possibilities for change narrows. The opportunity for conversation suffers, and our understanding of our loved one's experience from a different point of view, besides our own, becomes less possible. When I talk to him now, I try to speak from my own experience, especially about my own fears and anxieties, something we share. I find this approach leads to more intimacy. We become allies that sometimes allows me to speak to his voices and come to understand their causes and meanings. Clara, if you could put on slide 5. Another important ingredient for our recovery as family members was seeking.
Ed, I'm so sorry. I bumped my mouse, and I think I'm on the wrong slide. Am I on the, do I go to the next slide?
Yeah, go to the next slide. Next one.
I'm sorry.
No, that's at the beginning.
Okay.
Keep going. Keep going.
Sorry.
All right, right there. That's slide 5, I think.
Sorry.
It's all right. So there we are. Good. Another important ingredient for our recovery as family members was seeking community with others. The Bay Area Hearing Voices Network started as a small group of family members, clinicians, and those with lived experiences. We started meeting in the meeting room of a clinic where one of our members worked, and we were searching for alternatives to the prevailing medical model that we felt had failed us and our loved ones. Next slide, Claire. Slide 6. What united, 6, yeah, there you go. What united us were shared values from the National Hearing Voices Movement, HVN USA. Chief among them was the value that there was no assumption of illness of our loved ones, that the voices themselves are not the problem, that hearing voices can be understood as a natural part of the human experience, and diverse explanations are accepted for origins of the voices. We also found it was important we look at our language. This included stepping away from diagnostic descriptions like schizophrenia, delusion, bipolar, paranoia, and psychosis that actually serve to limit our understanding and interpretation of experiences and realities that are quite different from our own. Next slide, Claire. Discarding these labels also helped us bridge differences within our small group. As voice hearers, many had been hospitalized against their will by their family members, and so carried anger and suspicion about working together. As family members, we had been frightened by our loved ones' experiences, actions, and anger, which was sometimes directed at us. Slide 8, Claire, next slide. By listening to each other and having unity around what we stand for as an organization, we gradually learn to trust each other. As family members, this is not unlike the struggles we experience in our own families as we work through our differences. This struggle also turned out to be a good model for our groups as these issues come up all the time. We decided to start an adult drop-in hearing voices group. The group was free, held in a community drop-in center, and was open to anyone who heard voices or had visions or other unusual experiences. It was led by 2 trained facilitators in the hearing voices approach with lived experience. Both facilitators were not paid and volunteered their time. Next slide, Claire. We agreed on a list of hearing voices group values we learned from the HVN-USA Charter. They include, as I had mentioned, no assumption of illness, challenge society's norms on what is normal, respect our loved ones' experience, honor that we are all experts of our own experiences and are free to interpret our experiences in any way, take ownership of our feelings as much as possible, use ordinary common language, and commit to undoing stigma and stereotypes of voice hearers and others with unusual experiences. Next slide, Claire. As facilitators, we use VCVC as one of our models: validation, curiosity, vulnerability, and community. With family members, I find this model to be especially useful. So often in our family member groups, parents have difficulty communicating with their loved ones. That happens, as I mentioned, that happens all the time. As family members, we have so much difficulty, we focus on our loved one. And often, family members come into their group and they're experts on their loved one's experiences and behavior, but are unclear about what they're feeling and how to communicate or have a conversation with their loved one who often turns away from them. And so we use this model, VCVC, and it's very, very helpful. It helps us to step back from our assumptions, judgments, and agendas and look at our responses to our loved ones' experiences. So we offer validation, curiosity, and our own vulnerability, and try to open up community that opens new lines of communication. And many family members find it very difficult to do this, but when you start this practice over time, my experience is that it really builds bridges with our loved ones. Let's see. Slide 11, I think, Claire. We also attended a 3-day HVN-USA facilitator training, co-sponsored by our network and a statewide integrated mental health program where one of our board members is employed. 25 people attended, 13 family members and those with lived experiences, and 12 clinicians. It served as a springboard to allow us to start more groups, including one at their San Francisco clinic. The training also gave us confidence and support that we too could step into leading groups. They taught us as family members and voice hearers to value our experiences and encouraged us to access them to support others by sharing our experiences, to really talk from our own lives and our own experiences. We decided to become a certified nonprofit 501c3 This has helped us apply for grants and partner with other mental health agencies to fund more trainings and expand the number of HVN groups we offer. We found it was important to create a formal structure, a model organization based on our own culture and values in order to sustain our groups long-term with trained HVN facilitators that were paid a decent wage. Our first contract funded an adult Berkeley Hearing Voices group for 1 year. It met every week for 2 hours and paid 2 facilitators and rent at a local senior center. All our groups are official HVN-USA chartered groups and follows their values. No notes or names of participants are taken, and facilitators are HVN-USA trained with lived experience. As facilitators, we consider ourselves members of the group. Clara, if you could look at slide 12. As our groups have grown, family members and voice hearers have created a close community. In the past, hospitalization, medication, and stigma had isolates many of us. Voice hearers especially are reluctant to talk about their voices to family or friends for fear of being ostracized and hospitalized. I remember trying to talk to some of my friends and other family members about what we were going through, and most of them assumed my son was crazy and needed to be hospitalized and drugged. We felt isolated and wary about talking about our struggles, and so felt cut off from support and contact in order to cope with this crisis. When voice hearers join a Hearing Voices group, they find a community of people who, like themselves, hear voices or have unusual experiences that society finds threatening for some reason. Often, for the first time, they feel safe to talk about their experiences and are able to reach out for support. At least in Hearing Voices groups, their world becomes a less threatening place. And even outside the group, group members often reach out to each other as sources of support. Many are able to come out of isolation for the first time. This is in stark contrast to hospitalization, which isolates them from family members and friends. As family members, we also are able to come out of isolation in a group that provides a safe place to talk about our feelings and our fears. Often for the first time, we start to own our fears and learn to communicate with our loved ones from a place of curiosity, loving kindness, and compassion. Next slide, Claire. We have continued this model since 2016 and have added to the number of groups in Berkeley to include a family members group, a transition age group, a TAY group, and a game night group for fun. We have also used this model to add 2 weekly adult Hearing Voices groups in San Francisco in partnership with 2 mental health agencies there. Like our Berkeley groups, they are independent with trained facilitators from our network and follow HV values. With the COVID epidemic, we offer all HV groups online, Monday through Wednesday evenings from 6 to 8 p.m. We have also added a game group on Thursday, a place for us to hang out and play games online. Attendance varies to around 8 to 12 people each night, and individuals actually attend from all over the country. We hope to expand our outreach so that these groups eventually become an integral part of the San Francisco Bay Area mainstream mental health care options for voice hearers and family members. Thank you. And Claire, you're going to open it up for questions.
So if all the panelists could unmute themselves, and we please continue asking questions through the chat. Okay, Judy asks, we are going on a family vacation in August with our 3 adult children and son-in-law. If my loved one has a time of difficulty with his symptoms of voices, what advice do you have for responding to these periods? Oh, sorry.
Well, as a family member, it's that model that I talked about, VCVC, and it really involves listening and curiosity and being present with our loved one. And maybe that might involve, going for a walk and just being there for them and listening and asking questions without assumptions or labeling, and letting them know that it's a safe place for them to talk to you. And I say going for a walk or something, because I think it's very difficult because often, and maybe Dimitri can talk about this, you don't want to be the identified patient in your family. And
So jumping in, I think that keeping things human, it's such kind of simple advice, but it's surprised how much it's overlooked. That when somebody wants to talk, take them at their word that they want to talk. They're not looking for you to solve their world. Saying things out loud, being able to have connection. There's a lot of value in this. And I think it's great that you're traveling together. In my experience, especially with difficulties paying attention, the more you have in your life that is not the voices, the easier it is to train your brain, so to speak, to pay attention where you want it to. And for those people that want that to be a physical world without voices, having those experiences is really important. So I want to say I'm glad that you're doing that.
Pat, would you like to comment?
I was just gonna add how, for instance, next week when we're going on vacation, and the important thing in talking to my son is accepting that, there might be times that he wants to be on his own. There might be times that I might want to be on my own. I don't think that's limited to people with voices. And maybe in my own history of having to take care of myself with health issues, I've been able to model that without kind of, knowing it. But being able to talk about, options, plan A, plan B. I mean, we got together, we had a family birthday a few weeks ago, and, there's a lot of us, and my son was coming, and he said, yeah, I probably don't want to stay very long. And I said, yeah, I'm really tired. I won't either. And so I think we stayed for about an hour, and we were leaving, and he said, well, why did you want to leave so early? So, it's talking about, what each of us needs and being honest. And I think normalizing that as much as possible, because we don't always want to be around people all of the time, Thanks.
Thank you all. Rachel.
I just want to add one quick thing, Claire, and that is that I think that as a family, as a parent, I think you need also, we need to really own our anxiety about it and our worries. And I remember in a lot of our groups, one of the family members came in, and she said, well, my son just tells me not to worry about him so much. And I think that was really, really good, because I think that as parents, we're programmed to be anxious about our children. And we need to own that and try to and deal with that and acknowledge that and not act on it.
Thank you, Ed. Rachel asks, Pat brought up the issue of having her physical health symptoms dismissed. How can people with a psychosis history and their families advocate for physical diagnostic assessments beyond holistic alternatives?
I saw that question and I was a little confused. I don't know if it made more sense to somebody else. It sounds like, is it the person with experiences of voices and unusual beliefs that's looking for some kind of help beyond the alternative in terms of medical? I'm sorry, I'm a little confused. I don't know if Ed or Dimitri, if that's more clear for you, or if Rachel could repeat.
Yeah, at least for me, maybe there's kind of two sides to it. I've seen people that kind of very much wanted MRIs of their brain and kind of like, you know, other scans to see if there was something causing their experience. I have yet to encounter a person that has actually seen benefit from those kinds of studies. So I don't know much about advocating for them, but wanted to mention that. On the other hand, though, I did want to bring up a critical point. I actually, unfortunately, know somebody who passed away. They were complaining of pain in the abdomen repeatedly, and there were a voice here, and we can't prove it, but our theory is that the doctor kind of dismissed them, and that it was a serious problem. So it was something, they did the basic scans, you know, they did the foundational minimum, but I think that there was a dismissal when the most likely circumstances were ruled out. And in that, I think, especially in the context of family members, it's very critical that if somebody's saying they're going through something physical or having a physical sensation, even if they think it's being caused by the voices, you know, there could be an attribution, which you can interpret in many ways. But if something's going through something physical, don't back down from advocacy of getting multiple opinions and really getting the same level of care that you feel any other person would receive.
I really totally agree with what Dimitri is saying, and that for our family, looking at autoimmune issues has been really, really important. And I think this kind of investigation is just starting for a lot of people. But for us, we found it to be incredibly important to partner with a doctor who also was proficient in this kind of area and offered not drugs, but supplements, vitamin supplements that have proved to be very, very helpful. For example, Robert Whitaker writes about gluten and gluten intolerance, which affects your intestinal as well as brain health. And my son is gluten intolerant, so is my wife, and it's really had a big effect. So looking at those kinds of issues has been, for us at least, incredibly important and healing. And I think this is an area that's just beginning.
Yes, and in addition, physical medical issues often create the conditions for people to experience psychosis. Susanna Cahalan, who is a journalist, still is a journalist working in New York City, wrote an amazing memoir entitled Brain on Fire, which describes her becoming acutely psychotic very quickly as a result of a rare autoimmune disorder. And she languished for over a year until a brilliant physician discovered her the actual cause of her psychotic symptoms.
Yeah, during the war in Britain, they called schizophrenia the bread disease because so many people were eating gluten because they didn't have very much meat. And so this has been around for a while.
Yes, I met a young woman years ago at a hospital where I was working who had a schizophrenia diagnosis because she had a gluten intolerance. Was, uh,
Absolutely.
having a gluten intolerance. But thank you all. Let's see, the next question. Kathleen says, my 45-year-old son is doing pretty well, but is very distracted with many voices all day long. He is not currently employed. He lives on his own. He has never been hospitalized, nor has he taken meds. I'm not in favor of meds, but wonder if anything useful has been introduced or has been found to be effective for the voices. Dimitri.
So I think that there's many different kind of angles of where people could have challenges with voices. The ones that I think about most are attention, belief structures, and navigating overall dynamics to create positive voices. When it comes to attention, as far as I know, there's no RX that kind of focuses on voices and attention. But I have seen in many people that the more they train it, the better it gets. So kind of things that don't work, right? Watching movies with family members, because often you're just talking to your voices in the background. Things that do work, sport, um, music, things that kind of require focus, and it'll be difficult at first. And I'm not saying this is a medical professional, just kind of, anecdotal evidence with both myself and others I've encountered. Um, Attention away from voices is something that can be actively trained over time. And family members can help by really engaging in those activities that require focus.
Yes, and I wrote in the chat the title of Dimitri's book and the fact that, there are a lot of really useful pragmatic.
I also think that this gives you an opportunity to start the process of having and creating a dialogue with your loved one. And the first step is really acknowledging your own feelings about what they're going through in terms of the labels and judgments and, your expectations of them about how they should lead their life. And just to acknowledge that, and then to really start a conversation, but start from your own experience. Use the I word, not the you word. And, and it means being vulnerable. And as parents, we're not used to doing that. We're used to being more or less in control, although that's a fantasy as well. But that's sort of where I started with myself.
I would like to add that as a voice hearer myself who learned to negotiate the terms of relationship with my voices, it has been very useful to understand where they came from and, and really, advocating for myself against my voices. And, if they were telling lies about me to my face, I would argue with them. And it's best to argue with, to treat them with greater kindness than I did because I suffered more. But it is possible to negotiate the terms of relationship with our voices. One of the wonderful titles in the ISPS book list is Psychosis and Emotion. And there is an understanding that our voices probably more than visions, and voices and other unusual experiences more than the visions come from our unresolved emotions. When we are denying our feelings, then we're not taking care of ourselves. And a lot of times our voices are just trying to tell us that something's wrong. And for me, I found that living as fully as I could in the world and being as engaged as possible, as Dimitri was just saying, with the people I care about was hugely important. And I found the balance. I have taken medications for less than 2 years out of the past 38. I did whatever was necessary to find the balance between being as fully myself as possible and managing the voices.
To jump in to kind of reinforce what people are saying, well, I guess Ed mostly about being a parent. And for me, finding other parents that I could talk to that I knew understood, you know, how I was feeling about my son, for instance, when he was locked in his room and he wouldn't say anything and wouldn't come out for days. That before I even could approach him, I really needed to find my support people that could help me find the approach that was going to feel good to me, that was going to be respectful for him. And I know there's a Monday night family and friends HVN group. I believe that it's 8 o'clock Eastern time. And there's one on Thursday. Did Ed just go somewhere? There's one on Thursday that Ed does co-facilitates. And I think that it's, is that 4 o'clock Pacific time on Thursday? I'm sorry, Ed, I caught you off guard, but they have been immensely helpful. 3 o'clock Pacific time, because I didn't see it on the, when you were going through the slides and the groups that were online, I didn't see the Thursday one, but that's still going on.
Oh, absolutely. It's actually through Wildflower. It's not through our network, but it's through the Wildflower Alliance, and it's 3 o'clock Pacific Standard Time. And just go online to Wildflower Alliance, and you can get times and how to join it.
Oops. So Colin wrote a lovely comment. Sorry, I lost it. I was trying to respond to.
I think he wrote that one I saw from Colin was that he learned more on philosophy and politics from people going through psychosis than from anyone else. I just wanted to point that out, to like, same here. Those groups, when we're actually open with each other and talk about what we think about the world, easily some of the most interesting experiences of my life. I don't know if that's the one you're referring to, Claire, or not.
Oh, thank you for jumping in. And Renee writes, a work colleague was able to tell me honestly about his experiences, and I learned so much more than I had in years of mental health professional training. I wish there were more opportunities like this for equal power discussions as human beings. And yes, but panelists who would, yeah, the power dynamic is one of the most challenging things for us voice hearers to deal with.
I also might want to add that there are actually 3 Hearing Voices family members groups. There's the one on Thursday, and then there's 2 on Monday, one on the East Coast and one on the West Coast. And you can find it from our website, Bay Area Hearing Voices, but you can also find out the other one, which is also sponsored by HVN USA. And just go to those websites and get the times and just join the groups.
Thank you. So the next one is specifically for Dimitri. Does Dimitri have an opinion as to why people are so skeptical of voice hearers? I heard of a Jewish voice hearer being disbelieved when explaining kosher food.
Yeah, I mean, look, I'm going to talk about a movie that I actually really enjoyed, Joker, right? With won the Best Picture for actor and everything, but what a cheap shot, right? Like, how do we show that somebody's mentally unstable in any major form of media? We'll just have them hear voices or see people. And that's kind of mainstream entertainment. Or even news publications. Police arrived at the scene. John Doe, who is a voice hearer, was getting agitated because his neighbor kept mowing his lawn. Like, yeah, that happens to anybody. You don't have to mention that he's a voice hearer. But movies, books, news, everywhere we see, it's kind of become the primary definer, right? Like, how do we show that somebody's mentally unstable? Oh, they hear voices, great. Let's write that into the character. Let's point that out about this person. And so unfortunately, the culture has become detached from reality. It's ironic, right? Society's in a delusion about voice hearers. And there's also a game theory component too, right? So that means the more this is the mainstream media, the more voice hearers who are not that picture, which is most of us, don't want to come out and admit our experience, right? Because we get labeled more and more with that crisis or adversity mindset. And so the people vocal in our community usually are the ones who can no longer prevent themselves from being exposed, rather than the vast majority of us that are living our lives and are nothing like the mainstream media on our experience. So that's my take on that.
And I just want to add something, the founders of every major religion in our human history heard voices and saw visions. And it's ironic that people don't remember that or don't realize that.
Well, and Ronnie, Kathleen wrote, can people find the friendly voices to be companions, sort of? My son has told me that he believes the voices belong to real people that communicate telepathically. Is that a common belief?
I would love to take first answer on that. So in facilitating groups, I've worked with a lot of different frameworks. Telepathy is honestly my favorite one for a few reasons. At first, it's really brutal, right? Because it's like, this is real, I need to find these people, all that. But in the long run, if you use certain techniques, it can improve. So first of all, in telepathy, in theory, you can have voices that are all sorts of people. You're not limited to one or two voices. And that means that because there's all sorts of people, you can find voice allies. So even if some of your voices are negative, usually in that model, if you're not limited to just hearing the same person over and over, you could have a range of voices, and some will even defend you from the hostile voices, or do all sorts of things that make your life easier, guide you, inspire you. The second thing, just on the topic of the telepathy model, in the telepathy model, law exists. In America, at least, or in most countries, there's laws about communication and privacy, which means voices can't break into your head to steal information, because privacy laws apply to every platform. Social media, Facebook didn't need a new law. There's just laws about private information. And so there's laws about communication. You can't use hostile words to aggress at somebody. And so once people realize that in the telepathy model, it gives them a place to kind of hold the line against their voices, the idea of law, and to rally a lot of voice allies in support of that principle, because it's such a core principle. So the telepathy model can be very difficult, but I think that there's a lot of paths for finding friendly voices and finding places to kind of hold the line on negotiations and dynamics, even with hostile voices.
Yes, thank you. Dimitri, you know way more about telepathy model than I do, but I have experienced telepathy model. And during my the most serious struggle with active voice hearing and physical manifestations, as well as command voices, my kind voices guided me through that. And I kept calling for help, and they began paying attention, and they, asked me a lot of questions about who I was, but decided to help me. And ultimately, I learned that if I spoke the truth, then I was able to counter my negative voices. I found that the negative voices were never as smart or creative as I am. My positive voices often seemed omniscient, brilliant, and amazing. So so yes, your son can be he may indeed be communicating with parts of himself, but also possibly other people. There are a group of people known as empaths who are extremely sensitive, and our bodies understand so much more than our intellects necessarily do, because intellect is rational, whereas our physiological responses to the world is all its mind and body, and all of the array of ways in which we experience the world and learn to understand it. And I need to stop going on and on.
I just want to add, Claire, over the years, my son's voices have shifted. And initially they were, frightening and saying some nasty things to him and stuff like that. And now they've moved, they've changed, and they're more advisory and actually quite helpful. And so I think those kinds of, just like all of us, we all change, and our voice hearing experience is no different.
Yes, and I think trusting that ultimately, even the unkind voices are trying to tell us something that we're not doing right in our lives. We're trying too hard to please everybody, or please this idea of who we have ourselves because of this unrealistic idea of who we want to be. Whatever it is, we're not. Being realistic can be really boring, but it can also feel like, I'm sorry.
I actually want to jump in again one more time because there's something I really should have even included in my talk, and Ed touched on it, now Claire, you have it as well. Reality of the voices, different perspectives. I think that there's something family members fundamentally miss in most of my experience, that voice hearers get usually about 1 year or 2 years. In the first year, we also very much wonder what is happening. My senses are telling me something. Is it actually medical, like people are telling me? Is it telepathy? Am I talking to angels? The voice hearers that I've seen really reclaim their life, lose interest in the question to a degree of what is happening. And it becomes more a question of, how do I improve my experience? How do I make this positive in the dynamics, in the overall inspiration I get, in my attention? And this question of how, often for family members, for some reason, is very ingrained to the what, right? That my family member will only get better or have a high quality life if they agree that this is pathology. And just, I could find research for it. I have seen research for it in my own anecdotal experience and so many other facilitators' anecdotal experience. It doesn't truly matter that much. The question of how to improve quality of life is not directly linked to an understand of the framework for how we understand the experience. They're separate things.
I would love to jump in and think about what it would be like if parents, for example, were able to see these experiences of loved ones starting to hear voices, have unusual beliefs. And if we could celebrate and encourage and accept, oh, you're hearing some voices now. Oh, do you want to talk to me about them? Oh, yeah, we've had other people in the family that have heard some voices, or even maybe that's been a conversation that people had. Oh, they get to hear voices. I wonder what those voices say. And to see it as an opportunity for more communication and bonding, and hold it just like families that are gifted in athletics, or families that are gifted in academics. I mean, it's to be able to see it as another gift to bring people together, rather than, the fear, and now we have to, find out what's going on, and we have to fix it, and we have to put people in the hospital, and we have to bring them to all these doctors. And, I'm sorry, in listening to everybody, I just saw this vision of what that could be like, kind of like the tribal people, hold up the person that's the shaman in the village, and everybody reveres this person. They go to them for healing. What could it be like?
Absolutely, Pat. In fact, there's a film made about that called Crazy Wise, and where he went all over the world and looked at interviewed people that hear voices, and it's seen as a gift. This person is a shaman in their community, and where there's people are having difficulty with their experiences, they don't isolate them. They stay within their community, and the outcomes are far better in poorer third world countries than they are in this country, where we're, give them boatloads of drugs. I'll put the name of the film in the chat room.
Thank you, Ed. And we're now at 1:34. There are a lot more questions, and there are some, you have everyone has the panelists' email addresses, but there is one that is really for Ed, and it might be useful because of all the work you've done in the Bay Area to establish a 501c3. So Penny asks, we're a small group of family supporters in the UK who meet to help each other, mainly in communicating better with our loved ones. We share your values. Not all our loved ones hear voices, and your type of approach works for all. I would like to know how you manage to organize more local help. Do you get administrative grants? We would prefer to have more focus on support than organizational pressures.
Right. Well, you're right. Our model has been to create an organization, and that included, at least in this country, becoming a 501c3 with a board of directors. And it's a lot of work. One of the people in our group had some talent and expertise in this area. And then what we did is that we partnered with some mental health care agencies who were not threatened by the Hearing Voices movement and actually wanted to partner with us in the groups. And so after we got trained as facilitators, they agreed to fund the groups and allowed us to essentially staff and manage the groups without using a traditional medical model framework, which means no notes are taken, no names are taken, people can come and go as they please. And so this partnership has worked for us both in locally where I live, but also in San Francisco with other people who have heard about us and want to partner with us on our conditions, basically, because they've seen how valuable it is, where people can come and go, come to the group or not come to the group, and don't talk for 6 months or a year and feel comfortable and get support in the group. And so that partnership that we've been able to get with folks has been really important. The other thing that has been helpful is that, at least in California, they did a millionaire's tax, where 1% of millionaires' income goes toward mental health services in California. And that was voted on by the voters. And that has been really helpful in terms of funding more recovery-oriented models. And those funds actually fund all our groups. So.
Thank you so much, Ed. And I'd like to read one final question because I do think it's important. Does anyone have any? Oh, sorry, Pat, did you want?
I'm sorry. Could I just add that I know some parents in the UK that are working on a few, family groups there. And if you would like to contact me, I can put you in touch with them. I'm not sure, exactly if they're doing what you would like to, but at least you'd have somebody in your country that is very familiar with networks for parents that are available. Thank you. Go ahead.
Also there's somebody from the UK who who regularly attends our family members groups on Thursdays. And if you'd like I'm sure he'd love to get in touch with you. I've put my email in the chat, which I'll do again, and please, contact me and we can contact him as well.
So this is the last question for today, but you have everyone's email addresses. Does anyone have any thoughts on when families, parents, carers have a different framework or perspective than the voice hearer? I.e., if the person hearing voices wants to try medication, but the parents don't want that for their child, or the person holding beliefs that the parent's family cannot understand or relate to, how would people navigate these kinds of conflicts?
Closing on a doozy there.
Yeah. I could go first, I guess. I think that everyone that I've ever met has a secret weirdness to them in a beautiful way. I'll start with that thought. And that includes beliefs or perspectives or things that they want for themselves that is not quote unquote mainstream. And for me, that's one of my favorite parts about humanity is the uniqueness that can be found in each person. I think that there's a sense of agency that is lost often by the person hearing voices, that even in a state not of crisis, in a state not of potential harm to self or others, the question becomes, does the family gain agency over the voice hearer? And I think that that is flawed and needs to be moved, especially in cases that are not clear risk to self or others. I will say that on the whole, there's also a broader issue of informed consent, right? From all these possible choices, medication or not, framework or not, beliefs or not, do we really have options that are given both to the person going through the experience and their families? Is there a list of, I'll backtrack for a second and say, imagine a scenario where even if you don't believe in medical model, imagine that RX had a 90% success rate for helping people going through crisis. And so maybe in that case, you could say, okay, great. Like, there's something that works. There's a person that's struggling. Let's do it. But that's not reality. Most scenarios are closer to what Ed was saying, where people that follow the medical model do not reach positive outcomes. And so in that reality, especially, should we not present a broad range of options and let the person who is living their life make the key choices? So that's my view on that. Is families disagree all the time, beliefs are strange all the time, but we have the right to choose. It's our life to live, and in humility of the lack of understanding about all of this, we should definitely take a stance so that's not taken away.
Yeah, the only thing I could add to that, because I think Dimitri, you said it really well. If the family member is under 18, then we have a different kind of responsibility as parents, not in terms of really listening to what our loved one wants and would prefer and having dialogue about that. But it is different, at least, in our country. You've got a whole list of things that make it much more difficult for those below 18 and wanting to do things independently. But I think the key thing is the communication in the family and the point that everybody in the family is different and has uniqueness about them. And I would hope, I know open dialogue isn't everywhere in the country, but if there's a possibility of talking it through in a way, in a setting that their objective is to listen to all the voices and not that they can share the power rather than it be either the parents or, experts that, clinicians or providers or whatever.
I just like to add that that whole question about medication, it brings up an issue of empowerment to me, and that my son takes medication and it's his choice. And I can imagine when you're hospitalized against your will and told that you have to take medication and you're diagnosed, it's such a disempowering situation that you can be in. And I think as parents, we fall into that trap. And I think we have to be very careful about actions that we're taking to disempower our loved ones. And one of them is that we know better around medication than they do. And they're putting that in their bodies. And so he runs the show as far as that goes. And we support him there. And I at least in our experience, I found that to be a very empowering way to go for us.
Final words for the attendees.
Thanks. I just want to say thank you for all your attention and showing up today and your questions and your comments. And, you know, let's continue having family interactions in a shared space down the road.
So Stephen just wrote, thank you for speaking truth and bringing light to the challenging experience for families with voice hearers. My wife, daughter, and I are very appreciative of your time and sharing. It has been very worthwhile to us. Thank you, Pat, Ed, and Dimitri, for a wonderful webinar.